Welcome to Becoming Laron Anthony. I'm your host, Laron Anthony, and this is my life. Disclaimer: Becoming Laron Anthony is a podcast to help others through my shared experiences. This is not an attack for those who share these experiences through the episode topics. Parental advisory is strongly suggested. Hey y'all, welcome to episode 2. In tonight's episode, we'll be talking about my experiences with Christianity. Born and raised in the church, my late grandfather, Reverend Simp S.T. Brown, and my grandmother, Ethel Sweet Brown, are the founder and were the pastor and first lady of Christian Faith NBC Church, which is located on the west side of Chicago. In my household, we were very traditional and old-fashioned, meaning wherever both of my grandparents and my mom and her siblings were taught, brought up, etc., that's how we operated. My mom and her siblings were PKs, which is preacher's kids. Their whole life have always been about church and being in church. Church is their livelihood, and it also became me and my cousin's livelihood as well. They passed down their upbringing to us. My grandfather, Reverend Simp S.T. Brown, believed in attending church daily and being active and serving in the ministry. We didn't have no breaks. We would literally be in church all day from morning all the way up to the evening. By the time we couldn't even, by the time we would come in, it would be nighttime. So we'd be in church literally all day. We were made to go to church. We didn't have no choice. We attended Sunday school, Bible study, both youth choir and adult choir. Each and every one of my relatives had a role in the ministry, such as pastors, evangelists, bishops, psalmists, worship leaders, drummers, etc. My role that was in the ministry or in the church was singing in both the youth choir and adult choir, and I once played the drums a long time ago, just because each and every one of my boy cousins played drums. So I guess they thought it was going to be passed down to me, but as y'all can see, it didn't stick with me. So, as I stated earlier, my grandparents, my late grandfather, Reverend Simp S.T. Brown, and my grandmother, Ethel Sweet Brown, are the founder and were the pastor and first lady of Christian Faith NBC Church, again, which is located on the west side of Chicago. Being part of the founding family was an interesting dynamic. The reason why is because us being the first family, all eyes were on us, meaning we were constantly on display and people were watching and being observant and observing us as a family, and even within us individually. We were watched very closely and we had to play the part, but also become the part, meaning we had to adapt to the title as being the first family and following in the footsteps that both our grandparents and parents laid the foundation for us to walk in, which was an adjustment at first, but then it became second nature, and it was so easy to fulfill, but it was hard in the beginning because it felt like walking around on eggshells, because it was hard being so young and being a Christian, but it was also even harder when I didn't have a clue in who I was in God and in myself. Not knowing who I was in God and in myself was super hard for me because naturally, and I don't know why some people think this, but some people believe that when a person think of someone being a Christian, they think a Christian is someone who is perfect, holier than thou, and they do no wrong, etc. So again, me being young and not knowing who I am in God while growing up in the public eye, per se, in the church, I constantly felt victimized, especially in school, particularly in high school. I remember this individual once posed a question to me, and he said, "Aren't you a Christian? Because if you are, you shouldn't be doing this or saying that, etc." For me, I felt outcasted, and I felt like I was being put on the spot for no apparent reason. I remember I said something, and I think it contradicted what I claimed to be. But nevertheless, I said, but I claimed him to be, and that's why he posed a question. But again, people fail to realize that I'm human, just like them. And there's no such thing as a perfect Christian, or nor as a perfect person. But again, me not knowing who I was in God and in myself, then I easily failed into that trap, which caused me to go through a deep depression, but really into a deep pit of identity confusion. As you guys know, I've been molested, and I was molested by a man who wasn't or nor has a role in church or in ministry whatsoever. But because of being molested by a man, I went through a crisis of identity confusion. Because of going through a crisis of identity confusion, I questioned myself, and I even questioned God. Specifically, I questioned what God was doing in my life, and I even questioned him about me being molested by a man, and what does that says about me. Originally, I thought what happened to me was a sin, and that I was a sin, and that I even committed a sin through the act of me being molested. And even though I'm a victim, I wasn't the perpetrator, or nor did I ask to be molested. I didn't do nothing wrong, but that's what I thought. Going back to why I thought I sinned is because of what the Bible talks about when it comes to sin, sexual immorality, etc. Now, I don't want to quote the Bible because, for one, I don't want to get it wrong. And I know some people will say that you've been in church your whole life and you should know the Bible like the back of your hand. And yeah, that's true. But I'm young and I'm still learning. And like my grandmother once told me, that you never fully graduate from the Bible, meaning that you still have more to learn about the Bible, because reading God's word, we're constantly learning while reading and grasping his word, and it's an ongoing process. For a while, I stopped believing in God, and I even took on the role of playing God, meaning that I took on his role in my life and I started damning myself to hell because of what happened to me. I thought God wouldn't forgive me and that I wouldn't be accepted into heaven and wouldn't have a home in heaven. I just thought that there wasn't no hope for me and that I didn't have a soul that can be saved. Being around men in general made me uncomfortable. It felt like I was constantly on edge, and I felt uncomfortably closed off. At the time, men gave me the creeps, and I always felt like they were looking at me seductively, which made me feel unsafe, uncomfortable, and I just felt like I was put in an awkward position. Even though they touched me, and it can be in the most pleasant, appropriate, and opening way, I would feel disgusted, and it always made my flesh crawl. I would always get this feeling of discomfort, and I always felt like it would happen again. My body always gave me a signal or some sort of a reminder of what happened to me. So whenever it did that, I just felt uncomfortable, and it was extremely hard for me to shake it off. Plus, I've always felt like I was constantly being judged by men as well, which I was, because boys and certain men gave me a hard time because they always labeled me as gay. I've been called all sorts of names. I've been called gay my whole entire life. Like I stated earlier, I was going through an identity crisis. So initially, I thought I was because everything was pointing in that direction because of me being molested by a man, and both boys and men gave me a hard time, and it felt like as if they knew who I was. Meaning, most people who come as gay, you hear them tell their stories, and they always said people always knew that they was, but they didn't. So in this case of scenario, people thought about me. People thought that about me and have treated me accordingly to that. That's what I thought God thought about me, and that's why I damned myself before he could. Basically, I beat him to the punch. I come to realize that God knows my heart. He knows me better than people, better than myself, and he also loves me. He created me. He knows my imperfections, but still chooses me and chooses to love me in spite of. God's love is infinite. There's more love in him, and if you need more love, then he would give it to you openly and freely. It's literally there for you. All you have to do is just ask, and you have to receive it. Same thing goes to grace and mercy as well. That's what I learned from being molested and how that taught me about God. In this case scenario, you had to give it to God. But also know that it isn't your battle to bear, but it's the Lord's battle. You can't rely on your own strength because it's so much that you can do. But when you allow God to do it for you, then it's more than enough. Nothing is too hard for God. God can do what looks impossible and turn it around, which can become possible. And in that due season, joy will come in the morning light. I've also learned that I had to adapt to a new tradition instead of the old traditional Christianity, meaning that I had to trade in the faith that I know to get to the faith that will take me to the promise or to what God has promised me. I'm trading in what I know for something that I have yet to receive from God. This concludes episode 2. If you or someone you know have been a victim to sexual assault or is currently being sexually assaulted, please reach out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 800-656-4673, and it's available 24 hours. And to know that you aren't alone and you don't have to go through it alone. With that being said, this concludes the episode in Becoming a Christian and why it's important to include God in whatever situation you're in, especially when it's something like this, when it feels like you don't have no one to go to. In the next episode, I will be discussing my experiences when it comes to becoming healthier and mental health and what that has looked like for me, which is still an ongoing journey for me, and I think for a lot of people. So, no, I will be hitting close to home when it pertains to mental health. But until then, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this podcast. I am your host, Laron Anthony, and this is Becoming Laron Anthony.